This episode is brought to you by Pete's. Few things start your day better than a good coffee. That's why Pete's hand roasts their coffee from a specific selection of high-quality beans. And they don't just put those beans into anyone's hands. Pete's trains their roasters for 10,000 hours so they can master the roast that gives you the most. Pete's Coffee. Coffee for coffee people. Find Pete's online or at your local retailer.
Hello, Beat Check listeners. I'm Gosia Woźniacka, and I'm the environmental justice reporter at the Oregonian. Today, I'm with Ryan Reed. He's a wildland firefighter with the U.S. Forest Service and a graduate of the University of Oregon. He is also a member of the Karuk, Kupa, and Yurok tribes. As an Indigenous person, he co-founded and leads the Fire Generation Collaborative, an organization that supports young firefighters and others in the fire community who are proactively working with fire, and they're using fire to protect rural communities, restore ecosystems, and preserve vulnerable species. And if this sounds unusual to you, please keep listening. Today, we're going to be talking about the Northwest Forest Plan, which is a forest management plan, and also what it means to be an Indigenous fire practitioner and how firefighters can use fire to reduce future catastrophic wildfires. Welcome to the show, Ryan. Thanks for taking the time to speak with me.
Absolutely, Goshen. Appreciate the invitation and happy to be here.
Of course. So for starters, I just want to give our listeners a little overview of what this Northwest Forest Plan is, because it went into effect nearly 30 years ago in 1994, which is a long time. I was just a kid back then. So the Northwest Forest Plan was born out of these legal battles over the decline of the northern spotted owl. I'm sure all of our listeners have heard about that bird, coho salmon, and other wildlife dependent on old growth forests. And 30 years ago, those species were disappearing. And that's because the forests were being clear cut for timber at a maddening pace, and they were wiping out the habitat of the birds and the fish. So the Northwest Forest Plan basically limited logging in old growth reserves and ended these so-called timber wars. Though I should note that it didn't end all timber harvests on public land, and we might get to that later on. So why are we talking about this plan today? Because the U.S. Forest Service is developing an updated version of this plan. And that's because 30 years ago, the plan omitted topics such as climate change, wildfire, and Indigenous land stewardship. And those are all obviously very important topics today. And so this plan has to be modernized. And the new plan is going to be pretty important. It's going to guide forest management for the next century in 17 national forests in Oregon, Washington, and California. So hugely important in our region. And Ryan, you're going to have a front seat for this plan update. Ryan is a member of the Federal Advisory Committee that's helping to recommend updates to this plan. The committee just met in Portland earlier this month, and Ryan is the public representative on the committee. He was selected from a national pool of hundreds of applicants. And at 23, he's the committee's youngest member. So pretty exciting. Ryan, let's dive in and talk about why this plan is important to everybody in Oregon and other parts of the region. And let's just start with the bottom line. Like, why should people who live in cities or suburbs care about trees and forests? Like, what do trees and forests mean to humans?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a first important but simple question, right? Why should we care about this? And I think that's a question that a lot of people aren't asked every day of their lives, especially when you live in an urban, the urban interface, right? And so I think just asking those questions will allow folks to critically think about their life a little bit and how it intertwines and intersects with our natural, our quote unquote natural environment around us, right? And so, and I think that the importance of forest, you can name endless ones, right? Whether it's carbon sequestration, whether it's preservation of landscapes in which you can use for recreation and feeling like you're being grounded in this world. All these different from minor to extreme and major reasons. But I think it really comes down to is, why does it matter to you? How do you take a sense of responsibility of yourself and how you really fit in this world, right? And so that's one of the questions I grew up being asked is like, where do you fit and what's your role in this life, right? And I think that living in rather, serve cities or rather defined as urban areas, we kind of get into this uh, alienation from our natural environment.
Right.
And so, and I can't speak too much to that, just given that I didn't grow up in the city, and I'm currently in the city right now, but this is a very small portion of my life. But just under the little experience I've had in the city, it's easy to get caught up in not not circling around and grounding yourself in natural environments and the issues that pertain to these different landscapes across, I guess specifically as we're talking about the Northwest Forest Plan. And so I would say that
Yeah.
just essentially just how I think it really frames of what does it mean to you. And I think that whatever answer it might be, that's what is your role and responsibility of understanding the issues and solutions that pertain to that answer.
I think that's a great way of seeing it. And like you said, I mean, forests surround us. Even if we live in cities and suburbs, they're all around us.
Right.
They span pretty much the whole state and the whole region. So it's just that they're easy to ignore because maybe they're not in our backyard. But like you said,
Absolutely.
everybody has a reason to be connected to them. And so,
and and it could be a negative reason, right? So a big portion of this amendment process with the Northwest Forest Plan is wildfires, right? And so you know in extreme cases, if that's what you have to care about, then that's what you should care about, and so it's just unfortunate that there's certain issues in which the reasons why we care about certain things rather than the positive, the silver lining of things such as enjoying the environment, right? So I think those are all relevant and not to be, ignored is the issues in which we really need to hone in on.
yeah, absolutely. Well, let's talk a little bit about your background. You're an Indigenous person, and so you have kind of a
Mhm.
unique relationship with the forest and the land. Can you tell us a little bit about your background, where you come from, and what trees and forests mean to you and your community?
Absolutely. So I'm Kadu on Yurok, and so I grew up on my ancestral territory, in the mid Klamath River Basin, and I grew up kind of fighting for my rights as Indigenous people. I grew up as a young and going to different rallies, different protests to take the dams out in our river, in our system. And, those are one of my earliest memories alongside of dip netting at the Ishipishi Falls down there at Cudamine. And, those different memories is the earliest as they are. They have a profound impact on me, not just in a sense of place in which I had a great time and had these positive memories, but over time of still being connected to those practices, there is an evident loss that has been illustrated over time. And I, again, as you mentioned, I'm not very old, and so when I'm able to see a catastrophic transformation in how we're able to carry ourselves, whether it's as a community or as people who depend on salmon as a food source, and it really connects us to our practice and culture. When that starts to slowly disappear, you kind of get this sense of urgency, and so again, kind of tying back to the different things, my community depends on salmon. It depends on our cultural practice in order to persist. Uh, I, as many as other folks, can relate to say that we're a land based religion, and so we can't practice our religion anywhere else in the world. And so, if our practices and the landscape and everything else that is influence and factors on it, if it disappears, then so do we. And so
Mhm.
there's a sense of importance of these issues like the Northwest Forest Plan, of climate change, and so it's innate. It's by default because of the frontline community in which we are, right? And so
Mhm.
that's kind of what I grew up with. I kind of grew up with that atmosphere of knowing that nothing's going to be handed to me because I'm an Indigenous person, but also because if the things that we value as people who live on the Klamath, it's very dependent on which the rest of the world has a different perspective on things.
Mm.
And now we're seeing it amongst everything, right? It's not just the salmon, right? It's the catastrophic wildfires that are raising communities and threatening lives of not only firefighters but other communities as well. So it's very intense, and I kind of grew up in that intense environment.
Mm.
And now that the world is starting to see that intensity of catastrophic wildfires and climate change, now there is a sense of unprecedented vehicle in order to establish Indigenous leadership again. How do we kind of get back in the roles of being managers and stewards of the landscape? And so that's essentially why I'm here. That's kind of why I talk about the things that I talk about, and it really influences me as an Indigenous person. It's a part of my identity, right? So my community, the things in which we value, and the things that really are challengers of the things that we value. That's kind of why I'm here, and
Mhm.
and that's why it's so significant for me, essentially in short terms, protecting the forest and the streams and the ecosystems, right? Because it has everything to do with me. And I think that's one of the things, kind of back to your first question of why it's important to take care of it, because we as humans have a responsibility to the landscape. And
Mm.
for a long period of time, we've collectively have had a disconnect of the reciprocal relationship with the landscape. We've been taking, and
Mm.
now we're starting to feel the issues, where we're starting to have to deal with them, and my generation is the one's going to have to take that leadership on.
Yeah, yeah, it's catching up with us.
Exactly.
Mhm. And like you said, it's the you've felt the loss of many of those things on the landscape profoundly because your community is so tied um, to the landscape, the salmon, the trees.
Right.
Yeah. So let's talk about the significance of the Northwest Forest Plan. So there's obviously multiple groups that are involved in updating this plan. The
Hmm.
timber industry is very much involved, and they want to cut more trees and make sure logging isn't restricted. Environmental groups want to protect the old trees. They want to leave the forest, intact and virtually untouched. And your perspective as an Indigenous person is sort of somewhere in between, but really very different from those two perspectives.
Hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about your take on the plan and why it's important to you, why you became part of this committee, what you're hoping to accomplish?
Right. As I mentioned, a couple reasons of why I'm here, but I think collectively that it's more so it's less of what's at stake, but what is more of an opportunity. And I think that's my perspective of being on this committee is, what can we make of this opportunity, of this update of the plan? And the thing about our group collectively is that we kind of have a really good understanding in this point in time of what is lacking in the landscape, right? And that is one of those is Indigenous management and leadership. And I think that, you know, there's a lot more that entails with that. There's a lot more details and work that is implied that we still have yet to do work on. But I think that's my perspective as well, is that we're in this issues because of the lack of Indigenous management, as
Mhm.
well as lack of cultural fire and proactive management fire. And so, when we're thinking about what is at stake, I think it's more of, well, what's the opportunity for cultural fire and Indigenous
Mhm.
management to be reintroduced to the landscape, which is so definitely needed,
Mhm.
in the issues in which we're having to deal with right now.
Got it. And
And
can
yeah,
can I just ask you to give a very brief description of what Indigenous management means to you? We'll go back to it in detail, but
absolutely.
just so people know what we're talking about.
Yeah, so specifically as in this topic, you hear me say cultural fire versus prescribed fire. And so the significance about that, which will really pertain to the broader question, is that prescribed fire has very Western objectives, right? Whether it's fuel reduction, um, and I guess that's the main priority, is fuel reduction, right? And getting fire back to the landscape. But for cultural fire, there's significant objectives that are very intricate, that are very specific to any given area. So, we have different areas in which we depend on, whether it's basketry, whether it's hunting, whatever it might be. And so those are those cultural burns are tied in for that specific purpose, which has an interdisciplinary impact, meaning it can impact the terrestrial wildlife, it can impact certain plants on which we're prioritizing, it can impact the safety of our communities, right? And so for us, it's the cultural values that we depend on, whether it's medicines, whether it's food, or it's whether it's just overall stewardship. You know, we have specific objectives that pertain to us as a culture.
Mm,
Whereas, you know, a lot of prescribed fire is kind of a little bit more surface level, right? And
mhm,
so collectively, the indigenous management is that it pertains to the given ecosystem in which it's being conducted. Whereas if we look broadly, or federal management or mismanagement, however you want to describe it, over the past 100 plus years, it's been a blanket approach, right? It's a one size fit all, whereas a lot of indigenous folks have a good understanding and idea of what the landscape needs, and
mhm.
that's what we're gonna cater to, is the needs of the landscape.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of the important as we move into this conversation to
Mhm.
understand the differentiation, even though they're both proactive and they're really good forms of management.
Mm. It sounds like the U.S. Forest Service approach is really aimed at reducing fuels and preventing wildfires in that way, while the indigenous uh, land stewardship and the cultural use of fire is has to do really with the whole landscape. It's a lot more holistic. It doesn't just look at preventing fires, but it's also
Mhm.
looking at basically regenerating plants, helping animals thrive on
Absolutely.
the landscape, sort of the whole, really looks at the whole landscape as opposed to just one aspect of it, preventing catastrophic fires. So I think that's a great description. Thank you. Um, when I looked at the list of this committee that's working to update, the plan and give recommendations to the U.S. Forest Service, I was struck that there was five indigenous people on the committee. I believe out of 20 members, and that's a lot. And eh, I'm wondering what it means to you as an Indigenous person to be included on this committee. Do you feel like this is a step in the right direction from an agency that historically has really not been very inclusive, hasn't really engaged
Mhm.
Native Indigenous people in conversation?
Absolutely. And I think that I want to say that there's four indigenous people on the committee. So I want to note that I think that there might be someone else who represents another government, the tribal government.
Got it.
Um, I think that it is steps in the right direction. I really do, given the last plan and what followed, neglected tribal government, tribal people collectively, you know, and so I think that's one of the big priorities for us this time around. But I think it's also important to not be satisfied with that, right? So there's been often the conversation or narrative that there you have that box now that's been
Mhm.
scripted, and now you got to check it, and that's it. And I think it's significant to differentiate the sense of kind of doing your due diligence and making a real actual effort in implementing and including, and at some points taking the back seat in order for indigenous leadership to do what is necessary. And so I think that's one of the important notes, is that what does it mean for indigenous inclusion within this process? And it's not just consultation, it's not just speaking with tribes, but it's how can we give autonomy, how can we give rights back to indigenous people, as we've been here since time immemorial.
Got it. Got it. Well, I hope the U.S. Forest Service follows through with their efforts. Um, so let's talk about the cultural use of fire and what it means exactly. What does it mean to be an Indigenous fire practitioner? Can you talk about how your tribe has historically worked with fire and also how those practices were curtailed by the U.S. government?
Mhm. Absolutely. Indigenous Being an indigenous fire practitioner has a complex interaction, especially in today's society with the different policies and restrictions, right? So I think how I view indigenous practitionership is not and solely based on the fact of going out in the landscape and putting fire down. Although that is significant, and being a part of that is so rejuvenating, and is a form of ceremony. But I think in today's complexity, when it comes to fire, whether it's fear, whether it's complex, the importance of the impacts on it, whatever it might be, I feel like that being a practitioner is significant, and other folks have different approaches to it, and it's important to kind of lean on your skills, on your expertise, and run with that in order to make more space to to be able to go to that, the generic definition of going out and putting fire in landscape again, right? So I think that's overall the overall mission, but it's so complex and restricted now that that's not as clear cut and dry, right? So
Mhm. How was it
my
how was it in the past? How did your tribe,
right,
before the government stopped these practices, how did your tribes use the practice?
yeah. So again, I think one of the importance is to know that we lived in a matriarch society, and so our leaders were our elders, our elder women, telling everyone else within the given village, given tribe, however you want to phrase it, of what to do and when,
Mm,
and so one of the important notes, one of the things I want to emphasize is that we actually burn during the summers,
hmm,
in order to preserve high temperatures, high droughts, events, whatever it might be. But also, that's when you're going to be able to get the most consumption, right? So
mm,
you're going to be able to get the cleanest burns in the landscape. And it wasn't an issue because if you burn so often, then you wouldn't have fuel buildup as often. And so that's one of the significant portions that we didn't always burn during the times in which we're having to burn now because of the fires, 100 years of plus years of fire suppression and mismanagement. And so I think that's one of the things in which we want to kind of keep in mind, is that we're in a different era now when it comes to management. We
right,
can't just go and put fire in the landscape. That's
right.
unsafe, that's unwitty. And I think a lot of even indigenous fire practitioners understand that, right? Because
Mm,
it's contradicting of what our goal is. And so that is one of the things that is kind of misguided, misleaded within other management. Like, well, all right, we can't just go and put landscape on, put fire down. It's like, yes, that's very true, but there's a huge differentiation of approach of what we're doing, and who is in leadership in that moment. And so I guess that's one of the things I want to emphasize of how my tribe historically worked with fire, and we respect it as its separate entity. It's the giver and taker of life, which is not many things in this world has that skill set, that has the attributes. And
mhm,
so we need to respect it. And I think I want to note too is that the US government just didn't curtail our indigenous management practices. Those are actually very violent, a very intentional form of cultural erasure and
mm,
cultural genocide.
hmm,
And oftentimes it was like, okay, indigenous people used to burn, now we don't. Well, actually, my ancestors were murdered. We were very strategically put in the periphery of society, and demonized and criminalized for it. And in very similar ways, we're in the same way now,
mm,
right? We're considered arsonists if we try to put fire back in the landscape in which we know is productive and it's going to do well.
hmm.
Um, yeah, so I'll stop there, but I think it's important to know that as what it means to me, as indigenous person as well as other people, is that we kind of have this history which glooms over us, but
Mhm.
not too many people want to acknowledge that heavy presence of the colonial past, and which influences where everybody's at today.
Yeah, absolutely. Just for context, how many years did your society practice these cultural fire practices before they were stopped?
I can't speak too well to that historical component. I know that there's a lot of information I've gathered over the years that we were contacted relatively late in the mid 1800s, and then there's other policies and quotes from Forest Service leadership about criminalizing indigenous people for putting fire in the landscape, and that was probably early 1900s. Yeah, yeah. So a really long time, and so there's many generations um, lost of what it truly looks like, of what Indigenous management looks like. And so I
Yeah.
think that's one of the things we're trying to get back to.
Yeah, and I should add that yours isn't the only tribe that uses fire. There's other tribes in the U.S. that do this as well. So this
Absolutely.
is not a
Hmm.
this is not this wasn't an uncommon practice in the
Right.
past before the
Right.
U.S. government stepped in and basically put a stop to it in many places. So.
Yep. You're right
Um,
there.
I- Can you talk a little bit about how you and your tribe work with fire today, given the constraints of modern American society and the fact that
Hmm.
most people are afraid of fire? You know, we're taught from early on that fire is a terrible thing, that we need to fight it, get rid of it, never start it. We're afraid of it, I think, and whether we live in a city or in the country. And so, how do you practice in the middle of that fear? How do you move forward with your cultural practices?
Yeah. I think I live in a very um, I come from a community who is very ambitious about getting our fire practices reestablished, and I think that
Mhm.
has a lot to do of what we're able to accomplish, um, in addition to the different policies in which restrict us, right? And so, as the Kuduk tribe, which I'm primarily talk about, or where I'm derive a lot of my knowledge and perspective from, we are landless, and so we don't have a reservation in which we can
Mhm.
practice a lot of these different management strategies. And so a lot of it calls for co-stewardship and collaboration with the U.S. Forest Service, with other nonprofit organizations who have a little bit, who can help contribute capacity. And so overall, it's a lot of collaboration that is necessary. And I think that's what's unique about our community, is that it's not just natives versus non-natives,
Mhm.
right? It's kind of a more a more modern approach of what it takes in order to take care of the landscape around us, right? And that doesn't neglect that Indigenous leadership and our matriarch society needs to has a significant place, because it does. Um, but it's just saying that we can live a life where there's many different backgrounds with different identities who can come together and take care of the landscape.
Mhm.
And I think more specifically is that we have a limitation on when and how often we can burn. But I think my tribe, is doing a tremendous job of picking those windows and running with them and doing really good work with it. And so
Mhm.
that means going to our ceremonial areas and putting fire in the landscape, going around in our different culturally sensitive and significant areas, putting fire in the landscape, as well as being opportunistic with other wildfires during the summer. Maybe we take advantage of this really good low intensity burn that is unfortunately has happened, but we kind of have to we this is what we've been dealt, and so I think there's a lot of different cultural practitioners who are able to insert themselves into different opportunities, with the given scenarios, and take advantage of how we can take care of our landscape for less devastation and catastrophic uh, um, impacts.
Got it. Got it. And in order to do these cultural burns, do you have to get permits from the U.S. Forest Service? How does it work?
Yeah, I can't speak too much to that. Hopefully, I get into that portion in later parts of my career. But it definitely takes approval depending on the landscape in which trying to put fire, right? So we have a lot of we have sovereignty over our land trust areas, some of our ceremonial areas. And so it's really just up to us of, we're taking responsibility of this fire, right? And so kind of being smart with it. But if we're trying to put fire elsewhere, whereas 95% of the U.S. Forest Service manages our ancestral territory, there's a lot of collaboration that is necessary. There's a lot of fire managers and leadership on the Forest Service side that needs approval, and so I kind of tying back into that co-stewardship, that co-management, is significant. And so I think it's even in that consideration, it's even more important of how constructive and positive relationships how important those are moving forward when it comes to putting more Indigenous leadership and management into the landscape.
Got it. Got it. As a wildland firefighter, I mean, you work for the U.S. Forest Service, and you've been involved in prescribed burns in Oregon and California. Can you just kind of take us through what a cultural burn looks like? You know, what exactly you do, and is it, do you have to light it under certain conditions only? Like, what are the
Mhm.
security measures?
Yeah, yeah. I think in today's society, as I mentioned, that safety is the most important component of putting fire back on the landscape. Given that there are instances where it was intentional fire, which then became unintentional. Right? Really, true devastation is there, and I think it's going even more intense as climate change and the different events that are continuing on. And so safety is a huge component, and with safety, in order to maintain that, strategy is huge. And so, just especially with the experience in which the area or other fire managers have, there's different significant approaches to it, right? Given the weather conditions. And so there's a such thing as called a prescription, meaning that there's given parameters or criteria that the weather, as well as the consumption and fuels that they have, that is dependent on the success and the yes or no approval of putting fire in the landscape. And so sometimes that means it really depends on what landscape you're going to be on, right? Is it
Hmm.
steep terrain? Is it flat terrain? Is it kind of closer to the summer? Is it in the fall time, right? And so are you going to do burnt? Are you going to burn piles? Are you going to do broadcast burning? All these different elements are significant to what you got going on, right? So again, it's not as easy or as simple as putting finer landscape with given conditions, if it's pertained. There's a lot of safety precautions that are necessary in order to, again, to achieve the goals in which you want. And I think that everybody could say that threatening a community is not one of those goals. And
Hmm.
and so, given the conditions, in my mind, of when I think of good fire, is that it's a low intensity. If it's on a slope, it's backing down. You have many resources that are able to be there to attend any issues, any slops, any spotting, those kind of components. And then overall, you have large old growth species that are able to, that are historically dependent on fire to really thrive in those conditions, and seeing them flourish afterwards. And so even my even need to emphasize on the post fire stuff, right? Is there is the consumption, is there a lot of fuel in those areas? Are those going to be fire prone in the future? Are they going to be resilient in the future, right? And so I think that it really it depends on everything. Again, I'm going to say this again when it comes to fires, that it really depends. But I can, I have this dream of what a good fire adaptive uh, ecosystem looks like. And I'm thankful to live in an area in which we're starting to get more of those fire resilient ecosystems.
Hmm. And when you're doing these prescribed burns or cultural burns, it's multiple firefighters together in an area that's somewhat contained.
Right, right. So there's a lot of preparation that goes into it, right?
Hmm.
You most of the time dig a line, you put fire hoses around, you have water ready and able, but it's not always firefighters. That's the cool thing, is that you get community members who just volunteer their time. They understand the significance and the importance of putting good fire on the landscape. And so in these rather non-fire suppression projects, you get a lot of community members who come out and really contribute. And I think, again, that's a form of healing. It's a form of ceremony when we're kind of being, or when we're having that positive relationship with fire. And so it's reestablishing, it's really decolonizing the events that have occurred in the past and continue to occur in the future.
Hmm.
And yeah, so, and a good emphasis on the resources, the help that is necessary. It's not just a couple people going through and putting on fire landscape. Right now, you have a good given prescription that you have to stay in, and you have, a lot of resources and help in order to, maintain those objectives and goals.
Yeah, yeah. Um, Many of our listeners, I'm sure, have noticed that our wildfire seasons have become longer. Fires
Right.
are more intense. There's more acres burned. There's more extreme fire behavior, and fires creeping up to our towns and cities, and nasty smoke for many, many weeks. We've had that in the past few years, and alongside we've seen these massive efforts at fighting fires, where the U.S. Forest Service has really thrown a ton of resources, firefighters, tankers, heavy machinery, massive amounts of fire retardant coating the landscape, and also thinning and cutting old trees to stop fires. And at the same time, the U.S. Forest Service has also been talking about these prescribed burns, which are, sort of a facet of what your cultural burn practices are. Are those two things, are those approaches sort of counterproductive, or, on one hand, sort of all these
Oops, sorry.
resources and heavy
Cut out on
machines
my end.
and chemicals onto the fire, on the other hand, sort of talking about prescribed burns? Like, can both be done? Or should the U.S. Forest Service be moving more towards using fire as opposed to fighting fire?
Absolutely. In short, absolutely they should. But I think I also want to know, especially given getting a little insight of being a Forest Service employee and what that really
Hmm.
looks like. Um, it's not as clear cut and dry. I think a lot of fire managers, especially wildland firefighters, can all agree that putting proactive management practices are a lot better, whether it's livelihood, whether it's health wise, physically, mentally, whatever it might have it. It's a better situation, right? But given that public perception of what kind of fire is being put on landscape is a little bit gray, right? And so that's one of the things that us as folks who try to really put fire in the landscape, whether it's close to the cities or communities or it's in rural areas, is that public perception has a huge influence on what we can and cannot do, right? And so I think that simple point of education of fire is key, right? The differentiation, the fire behavior, the history, whatever it might be, getting a little bit of education in which can help influence your peers or your community members is going to be key for us fire managers to be able to implement proactive management, right? And so one of the examples I'll provide is that we go through a whole summer of smoke, right? Given that those are really harsh conditions for people with prior existing health conditions have to
Hmm.
endure. Absolutely understand that. But also when you want to come in and create more smoke during the times in which people really depend on to get clear air, healthier air.
Right.
And so this public perception on smoke is one of the driver influences of when you can or cannot have a proactive fire or a prescribed or cultural fire. And so the difference for me that I was always claimed is that there's a difference in smoke, even though it has the same impact, is that one smoke is being proactive. The other one is colonial, catastrophic with devastation impacts. And so for me, in simple terms, there's colonial smoke and then there's tribal community trust smoke. One is going to actually help prevent the amount of smoke in the future.
Right.
The other one is going to continue to raise havoc. And so one of those differentiations, like, all right, well, should we take a little bit more couple days to deal with smoke? So this landscape over here is a little bit more fire resistant, a little bit more fire resilient, right? And so that's one of the huge issues is the public perception is key, right? And that gives a sense of responsibility to fire managers to connect with the public, to connect with the communities, because it's important for them to understand what's going on around them, right? Given the circumstances, I don't blame anyone for being hypersensitive or aware of what's going on because of the extremes in which they've experienced or
Right.
they might experience in the future. Um, and so, again, back to kind of your actual question, is that there is a huge push in putting prescribed fire back in the landscape from higher up, But then there's that workforce issue. Kind of the component of what my organization really emphasized is younger generations being involved in fire. And so we're the young ones are not only going to be the leaders in the future, but we're the ones that are going to have to carry on a lot of the workforce and labor that are necessary to reduce fuels, to put fire in landscape, whatever you might want to kind of talk about. And so there's a huge emphasis on my part, as well as other climate activists who are my generation, to understand of what is it, why do we need to why do we need to focus on this, right? And so my call out is for younger generations to kind of get that little curiosity of where we where we kind of have a place in this issues, but also the older generational leadership understanding of where they can meet us, right? When are we going to get the compensation that is necessary? When are we going to get the inclusion and seat at the table that influence decision making? You know, and I guess that's a huge Indigenous characteristic and value is intergenerational transfer of knowledge. How are
Mm,
we going to be able to be ready for leadership positions in the future when we're not having to seat at the table, we're not being included or have avenues in which we can kind of partake in these issues, whether it's climate broadly or it's wildfires broadly. And so
mhm.
that's kind of one of the huge components in which I really believe Indigenous and leadership and management can really include is the intergenerational transfer of knowledge and really producing the next leaders of the futures and providing for next generations to come.
Yeah, yeah. So being part of this Northwest Forest Plan Committee is kind of a step in that direction, and also the organization that you founded, which supports young firefighters and fire community members.
Exactly.
Um, yeah, sounds like really
Exactly.
important. What you mentioned people's perception of prescribed burns. What are other barriers to instituting these practices on a wider scale? So, Ryan, you mentioned the perception that people have about fires and how that influences our ability to have prescribed burns.
Right.
What are some other barriers that prevent prescribed burns and cultural burns from happening on a wider scale?
Absolutely. Policies for sure. You know, there's a lot of higher up pressure, and I mean higher up as leadership, the hierarchy of things to provide pressure on us folks who are on the landscape doing the work to produce an X amount of acreage or X amount of objectives, right? And so there's that huge tension, and so what happens is that there's little to no understanding of what it takes to execute these objectives, right? And so a lot of, like I mentioned before, a lot of it's the workforce retention issues. The Forest Service has heavily felt that, especially in fire suppression efforts, but also the lack of compensation and the conditions in which us firefighters have to endure. And that's just a seasonal. That's just during the summers, right? And so there's a huge issue with your workforce generally, right?
Hmm,
And
hmm.
I think
You mean
that's
firefighters leaving the ranks?
leaving fire entirely or not be able to move up because of the limitations they got. And and I guess at the end of it, it's that personal issue of that you got to take care of your family at the end of the day.
Right.
You got to worry about your relationships. You got to worry about your health and well-being in the future. And so that is a huge component of why we can't get too much more fire in the landscape is because we just don't have the workforce and capacity to do it. And I
Yeah.
think that's why I'm so significant. I'm so uh, happy to see where the community I come from is that you have a lot of community members who are interested, who are willing to dedicate their time and eat a lot of smoke in order to create a more fire resilient community.
Hmm.
Um, that's a critical one, and then also the different pressures that is reactive of these different catastrophic wildfires in different locations of the west or even essentially the country is that when a large fire kind of comes through they have to react to these issues, the devastation that happens. And so that means that there's a limitation, there's a restriction in which enables prescribed and good proactive fire to be established. And so in other words, one of the solutions for me in which I've perceived is that ecosystems need to be managed as ecosystems. They don't need to be managed as states. They don't need to be managed as regions, right? Each given area has been historically managed differently. And so if we're having back to the blanket management strategy, is that it's not adequate. It doesn't enable folks to be able to take care of the landscape and cater to the needs of the landscape when we have policies that restrict certain areas because another given area that's a whole different climate, whole different that contains whole different fire behaviors, and so and essentially is that's where indigenous leadership and management comes in, is that they're very catered to a given landscape with
Mm.
specific needs and understanding of what fire behavior means, right? And so I guess there needs to be strategies implemented that pertain to Southern California rather than Northern California, or Oregon to mid California, or rural versus urban, right? And so all these there's different strategies in which need to be emphasized, re-articulated, and understood not only by the managers and the leadership, but also the rest of the community. And I think that there needs to be a little bit more risk um, that needs to be established in order to get into a safety and fire resilient stage. And it's unfortunate, right? It's kind of like it's really unfortunate, but I think it's we're going to be experiencing these really large mega fires if we don't take a dramatic step.
hmm And this brings me to a kind of a local question to the Portland area, which is that we have a fire right now burning in the Bull Run watershed. It's very much on the minds of everybody who lives in the Portland area because it's our primary source of water for the region. And I recently wrote a story about how the Bull Run has had no prescribed burns as a way to prevent larger fires. And the reasoning I was told is that there's a certain type of forest ecology in the Bull Run, a type of rainforest that doesn't necessarily lend itself to prescribed fires. So I'm wondering if you briefly can talk about whether there's certain types of forests where prescribed burning is better suited to them, and also is that changing in the era of climate change?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think that's a important one to emphasize. Is we have a broad spectrum of people who are listening right now with different given climates and areas. And so, especially is a huge emphasis within the Northwest Forest Plan is that we have climates of different ranges, some that are fire dependent, some that aren't. And I think that is a huge characteristic. But again, with climate change, we're starting to experience fire in areas in which we've can never really had them before, right? And so that sense of flexibility, that sense of adjusting and adapting to our climate is even more key, right? So that means that there are areas in which weren't historically fire dependent. Maybe that's changing, right? Given extreme climate change impacts. Um, and I would say that I can't speak too much to the forest, like the Bull Run area. But what I can say is that who are the indigenous people there? Who might know the answer to, or solutions to those given areas, right? And I think that's the importance of collaborating or taking the back seat and letting leaders, indigenous communities take initiative because they've been there since time immemorial, and
Mhm.
each area will say that, and I think that's the thing that we're learning is that there's a lot of stories, a lot of oral traditions in which really pertain specifically to forest management. And I think those we're going to get your answers. And I think that it's important to know that I guarantee that's not the first issue of climate change or changing ecosystems in which they've had to endure or what we've had to endure. And so I'll kind of leave that to that as like who's the indigenous folks who are from that area and have they been able to have a seat at the table?
Mm. Mhm. They might hold the answer. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. One last thing that I would like to talk about is the logging of old trees. So the timber industry, which is very much involved in the update to the Northwest Forest Plan, says that the best way to prevent catastrophic fires is to cut down some trees to reduce the fuels. And Oregon's timber industry has spent really thousands and thousands of dollars on
Right.
social media ads trying to promote logging to reduce wildfire risk. But science has shown that logging actually can make things worse and can make forests more prone to fires, not less.
Right.
So this idea, it's kind of a timber industry wants to log more, and Forest Service is kind of using thinning as a strategy.
Mhm.
But recently, President Biden has proposed a rule to change how old growth and mature forests are protected. He wants to have more protections. And so I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit about that, how we should protect old trees and why they matter.
Right. Absolutely. I think one of the things to emphasize, especially in the conversation of the Northwest Forest Plan area, we have a tremendous biodiversity, and and old growth is one of those characteristics of what biodiversity means. Especially when we're talking about redwoods, when we're talking about cedars, when we're talking about Doug fir, even all these different larger trees that they create ecosystems. They create specific conditions when we have a primary old growth forest, and so I think biodiversity is important to note when we're talking about this conversation. And so that kind of ties into the significance or that conversation of what logging, when to log, when not to log, right? And as I mentioned before, we can't just go and put fire on the landscape anymore like we did in the past. Um, and so it becomes, there are opportunities for thinning. There are opportunities for sustainability efforts that might include logging. Um, Now let's not get to, it's a slippery slope, right? And so there are folks who are really trying to emphasize or be opportunistic on these conditions. And I think it's important to know that a lot of times, or a lot of times in my area, which I'm speaking from, Northern California, and including the southern reaches of Oregon, is that a lot of these forests are fire dependent. And so if we kind of use fire as a tool rather than logging, then we're going to get more fire resilient forest. And so kind of just driving that point home is that let's reassess the tools in which we have historically have used, right? Whether it's indigenous proactive management of fire or the tools of logging and clear cutting, right? And how does that connect to the issues we're talking about?
Mhm.
And and for me as a wildland firefighter, when I'm going in an area with plantations on both sides of me, there's clear cuts there, but then it's just ultimate density of the forest at the same age growth. The biodiversity is limited or zero to none in some components. Those are issues. Those are just a matchbox waiting to be lit off.
Mm.
And back to the component of biodiversity within my area, there's so many different fire dependent species, but then there's also species that are a little bit more shy of fire, but that kind of that balance is necessary, right? Whether it's in species, whether it's in your lateral fuels and your heights of your trees, the age of your trees, those ecosystems within my area, and increasingly so within the Pacific Northwest, are fire resilient. They're more fire resilient than these same age growth trees. And that's one of the characteristics within logging and why it's such an issue ecologically, is not only the same length and once a fire gets into the crowns that takes off, but also just the biodiversity and the degradation on the soils, the other plants, the animals. And so we kind of get into this larger issue that, even though catastrophic wildfires is a large and probably the biggest part within, resilience, but then you have, when we're thinking generations ahead, the diversity is lost, and that means that the landscapes in which we're talking about will be lost as well.
Well, Ryan, I hope the U.S. Forest Service considers some of the issues that you have brought up and has a more holistic look at our landscape, including fire management. And best of luck in your work on the committee.
Thank you.
It's been a really fascinating conversation. I really appreciate the time you have spent with us. And we'll be following these topics closely in future stories at the OregonLive.com and in the Oregonian. And I'll drop a few links to relevant stories in the show notes. Thank you so much for listening to Beat Check with the Oregonian. If you like this show, please give us a 5-star rating and review in Apple Podcasts. It helps other people find the show. Best way to support our journalism and stories like this is with a subscription to Oregon Live. You can do that at OregonLive.com/pod support. Until next time, thank you.